I'd like to call this meeting to order. Today is Tuesday, November 12th, 2019. This is a Prescott City Council study session. Let's please call roll.
Mayor Mangarelli.
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Orr.
Here.
Councilman Blair.
Yes.
Councilman Good.
Here.
Councilman Lamerson.
Here.
Councilwoman Scholl.
Here.
Councilman Sischka.
Here.
All are present.
All right. Thank you for that. Welcome, everyone. We have one item today on our study session, which deals with the airport. And we will take public comment. If you'd like to do that, grab a public comment card, and we'll do that after the presentation.
It's there.
Let's start and end with item 3A.
Runway Extension Focused Planning Study for Prescott Regional Airport, Ernest A. Lovefield.
Good afternoon, members of council, mayor. I have Charlie McDermott here with Dibble Engineering, and he will be joining me in the course of this presentation. He's a planner with a tremendous amount of environmental experience as well, so we'll be able to answer questions if necessary. So today we're going to be talking about the future extension of the runway, the reasons why we need the runway, the challenges with the airline and scheduled airline passengers, being able to make all the flights, the runway study scope, an overview, and then a summary. So we should be here for about 30 to 40 minutes. So just a refresher, this is quite an extensive view of our scheduled airline passengers by calendar year. As you can see, we have done wonderfully in the last year. We had the 10,000 last year, and we expect to hit more than 27,000 enplanements this year. Just a refresher, the enplanements are going to actually be doubled to include deplanements to get the total passenger numbers. So when we say that we've accommodated 53,000 passengers, that's where that number comes from. So this is where we were at when the master plan study commenced about 2 years ago. I am going to be coming back to council next month to finalize the acceptance of the airport master plan. The projection was actually at that time verified by the FAA, and it was determined to be that our enplanements would reach about 42,000 by the year 2031. What's interesting is things have actually gone a little bit better than we expected at that time. And in fact, this year, the estimated was going to be 25.5, but with the extra flights that the airline has added for the holiday season, we're going to be at about 27.5. Now, even though we've revised the estimate, this is where I anticipate we're going to be in 5 years. This is actually quite extraordinary. This is actually a staff projection. It's based on the air carrier forecast and industry forecast, and this is actually conservative. The reason that the bars in the bar chart are different colors is right now we're up to the green part. Yellow part means that we are experiencing challenges with our current facilities on the airport, and they will be taxed to their absolute limits. And by the time you get to the red bar charts, these estimates could be compromised if we don't continue to develop the airfield meaningfully. So we're going to be talking about some challenges to airline service growth, two major areas. One is incompatible land use, and that's specifically sensitivity in the community to noise and overflight and airspace obstructions, and also density altitude, which leads us to the runway extension discussion. So we've been encouraging compatible land use, and part of what the council did is last year they adopted the public disclosure map that's on the Arizona Department of Real Estate website. That's on the left. And also in 2001, easements were put in place to help communicate to the community that the airport is there and that there may be some impacts associated with the proximity to the airport. Now, one of the challenges we face is airspace obstructions. And what that means is if a local neighbor leaves some trees, like you can see in the top left, in an area, it could actually affect flight. Now, there's two different evaluative tools that we use to look at airspace or airline concerns. The first one is a formal FAA process. It's called a Form 7460. That's a notice of construction or alteration form that's filled out, and often you can do an airspace analysis and we can see whether or not a proposed construction or object might interfere with flight. The second one is an airline safety evaluation. And folks aren't as aware of this. It's actually contingent on the airline's own safety practices, and also it has to do with the type of aircraft that's being used. And so they have a single engine departure that they have to take into account when they are looking at whether or not it's safe to fly in and out of Prescott with a certain weight on board the airplane. Okay, so we have to look at both of those, and these were actually generated by SkyWest Airlines for us, and it shows you different obstructions at the departure end of our main commercial service runway that can be taken into consideration and are taken into consideration in determining the maximum load that can be flown out. There's only 3 things that contribute to weight on board the aircraft. It's people, baggage, and fuel. And if you have weight limitations, something has to be reduced. Now, as a result of looking at obstructions around the airport, we've done extensive obstruction mitigation, and what you see in the circle is an area on the golf course where we have actually removed 15 trees, and that was to actually help encourage the full utilization of the aircraft using Prescott, particularly in the hot and high months, and we'll be talking about the airfield elevation and heat and how that affects aircraft performance. Because of taking out those trees, you can have on average in the summer months between 5 and 7 additional people on board the aircraft, which is a significant number. You can see over on the top left of this slide, this is a U.S. Forest Service aircraft from some years back. I think you can see why obstruction mitigation is important. Visually, we want to make sure that, obviously, that the aircraft don't have obstructions that they might run into. So let's talk about this term density altitude, because this is a second challenge that we're facing. And with density altitude, what happens is pressure, temperature, and humidity can influence the performance of an aircraft. It doesn't make the aircraft unsafe. What it means is that it may take longer for the aircraft to take off and land. So on the top right, you'll see the elevation of 5,000 feet. We're about 5,045 feet is the airfield elevation. It takes longer to take off at higher elevations. The second factor is when the air is more moist, particularly during our monsoon seasons. So what happens with that is it takes longer for the aircraft to take off and land. Another factor is the heat. And so on a hot summer day, again, for the aircraft, the aircraft performance is affected, and it takes a longer runway to take off and land. And at Prescott, when you combine all 3, then you can see that often the carrier has to make the decision to really substantially limit the weight on board the airplane so that it can take off in the available length of the runway, which is 7,619 feet. With these high density altitude issues, the aircraft has reduced engine power, reduced thrust, reduced lift, a longer takeoff distance, and a longer landing distance, along with a slower rate of climb. That's why sometimes people out in the community may see that aircraft seem to be lower to their house in the summertime. That's why. This is where it actually goes back to how it affects the airline. So in the red across the top, if you see that, this is actually what we refer to as block seats. So over the summer months, the LA flight actually had to block 5 seats per every departure, and we lost 515 seats over the last summer as a result of the fact that the runway is not long enough to be able to have that aircraft take off fully loaded with every passenger and all fuel and baggage required.
That in dollars?
You can average about $150 to $200 a ticket. So can you go ahead and figure that out real quick for me, Christy?
100,000.
Okay. In addition, we had 122 situations where the airline had to offer denied boarding compensation. Basically, we had hit the maximum available weight limit on the flight. The compensation ranged between $300 and $1,200 per person reportedly, and in some cases, the people paid less than $100 for their ticket. This is future travel compensation. Some people were really thrilled about that. But to be honest with you, that makes it difficult for the airline to justify operating out of Prescott if they have to give away 5. In some cases, they had to give away 10 seats. We had one flight where there were 15 people that were not accommodated because of the fact that these combination of factors came into play. 637 total unserved passengers, either by blocked seats or by voluntary denied boarding compensation, occurred since the airline started. But the scariest part of this is the future impact. Right now, they're starting Denver service in June, but in March, but they're having to cease Denver service in June because they don't feel with the runway length that they can serve during that time of the day, because getting to Denver takes more fuel than getting to LA. And so as a result, what you have is it doesn't make fiscal sense for them to offer the service for those 4 months over the summer. What you lose is 6,100 seats as a result of the short runway length. At an average load factor that we have here, which is 77%, that's 4,700 unserved passengers, in addition to the 637 from the LA routes and the conditions from last year. We're looking at over 5,000 total passengers that will not be served in the next year. In the following year, the carrier is also looking at adding an additional flight and would like to add an additional destination. The question is, if the destination is further away, will they be able to take off and land successfully and not have to block even more seats, because there will be more fuel required for a further destination? So we are looking at a substantial current and future impact that will be associated with keeping things as status quo. So Charlie, would you like to join me?
Thank you, Robin. Again, my name is Charlie McDermott. I'm the Aviation Planning Manager for Dibble Engineering, and I appreciate the opportunity to present to you this afternoon and for the opportunity to prepare this very important study. What I want to point out first is that this study is very different than your master plan. The master plan is a 20-year planning tool that looks at the overarching or the overall airport and what facilities you need to accommodate the existing and forecasted demand traffic. This study focuses solely on the runway extension and optimizes what runway length you need to serve your forecasted traffic, as Robin pointed out. What's really going to be important about this study is to try to find that perfect length that can really bring that 637 passengers that weren't able to fly down to as close to zero as we can. Now, everything comes with pros and cons. If we have to select a runway extension length that optimizes that number, because there may still be passengers that can't be served if we select a runway length that may be less expensive than another option. So we have to be very careful and mindful about this study in terms of what ultimate runway length that we select, because it's all give and take. Okay, so that's the objective of this particular this specific study. So with this study, I prepared a scope and a fee, which you have in front of you and that you're going to be taking action on this afternoon. One of the primary things we're going to be looking at is to validate the critical aircraft that came out of the master plan. The master plan selected a critical aircraft, again, for the entire airfield. We want to look at what is that critical aircraft specifically for this runway based on conversations with the airlines and what they envision their aircraft will be for the foreseeable future. So that's going to be a very important piece of information that's going to come out of the study, is what is that critical aircraft. That's going to be a very important part. The next very important part is gathering the passenger boarding information that Robin and her team have assembled, because that gives us a history, a track record, a trend of those boardings, and more importantly, which ones have been denied or weren't able to take off. So that analysis is very important. And again, that differs from the master plan, because the master plan was looking at overall operations for the entire airport. This is looking at just that runway, and now that we have a history for the past year and a half, that gives us really good data to go on, whereas the master plan didn't have that data because it was kind of done before this boarding issue arose. So with the critical aircraft and the boarding data, we'll be able to, again, create that runway length analysis that is going to be specific to the airline's needs for the foreseeable future, but again, is something that you can afford and what the FAA is willing to fund. So there's kind of a sweet spot there in determining what that best, most optimum runway length is going to be for your airport.
When you're talking about critical aircraft,
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about passengers right now, with United Express. how do you factor in our Forest Service Fire Center when you're looking at critical aircraft with the length of the runway?
So we're going to have a conversation with them to make sure that we understand what they operate today, what they envision operating tomorrow, and see how that fits in, again, with our critical aircraft and the runway length analysis. So they're going to play a role in that ultimate decision. Because just like, because I remember when we came here with the master plan talking about, well, we're going to propose a 10,000-foot runway, or we're going to propose 9,000, and we had that general conversation about what is the best for the master plan to depict. Now we're going to refine that into exactly how long is that runway going to be. Is it going to be 9,000? Again, talking with the fire service, the Forest Service to make sure that works for them. And if it doesn't, we'll have to have a conversation to adjust that. So there's going to be a lot of conversations going back and forth with the airlines and the Forest Service to make sure that everybody is on board with that runway length to make sure it optimizes what everybody's needs are going to be for the foreseeable future.
And I'd like to add to that, it's important to note that the FAA will not fund a runway extension for the purpose of the U.S. Forest Service. They will be a beneficiary. They will only use it for the critical aircraft that they agree is the critical future aircraft, which currently is estimated to be the Embraer 170 or 175, which is a 74-seat configuration aircraft. So we have to just be careful, because if we say the Forest Service is a predominant reason why we're doing this, they will not agree, and they'll say call the U.S. Forest Service and have them fund it.
Robin, there's a certain length of the runway before we have to move the tower. Is that my understanding?
There was a preliminary analysis done, as Charlie's going to be mentioning that he's going to validate the analysis, but the preliminary analysis used a tool that the FAA themselves provide. We met with them about the extension of the runway and at what point would be the breakoff point. There was this discussion of approximately 10,800 feet in length before they felt that discussion, before the analysis tool indicates that you would probably need an air traffic control relocation. I'd like to clarify, though, I'm absolutely sure that, because we're going to be involving our local air traffic control tower and the FAA in it, if there's additional factors they'd like us to put into other than just the basic formula that was used, then we'll have to take that into account, because some of the controllers at Prescott have indicated they feel that 10,800 might be too difficult for them to see the end of, and they want visual eye contact with the aircraft operating, as well as a vehicle that might be on there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So once we solidify the runway length analysis and everybody's on board of what that length is going to be, then we'll develop a series of runway extension alternatives. And again, this would include which parallel taxiways get extended, if one or both, what may be the priority. So we'll look at that, because those have cost implications, if just surely because the project is going to be primarily a fill project because of the way the terrain drops off. So that bringing up that fill for both the runway and both parallel taxiways, there may be some alternatives to doing that. In other words, whether we phase it, build one parallel taxiway, and then later on come back and do the second one, or boom, both at the same time. So we'll be doing some pros and cons and what the costs and implications of those alternatives may be. So we'll be looking at that in pretty good detail. As I mentioned, the grading, it will primarily be a fill project. So in other words, a lot of material has to come in from somewhere. There's going to be a cost associated with that, and we have to look at that as where will that fill come from, or where will the likely sources of that come from, and what those costs may be. So we'll be looking at that in much more detail. As Robin mentioned, the air traffic control tower, we will look at that to determine if our alternative that we select, or the runway length that we select, works for them, and if it doesn't, we'll document that and try to resolve that to the best that we can in terms of what could the best location and height be for that control tower. So we'll look at that. Forest Service, we talked about including them in the conversation. In addition, land acquisition, we'll look at, again, based on the runway length that we select, we'll look at what land is going to be needed, what those current uses are, and how much that land acquisition could cost or add to the cost of the project. And we'll look at land uses as well around the airport. Pavement design, because we know we know anyways from the engineering side, pavement design will be determined in terms of, again, what's that critical aircraft that is selected for the runway extension, what pavement design is going to be necessary and how that fits in with your current pavement design for the existing runway. So we'll look at that and acknowledge the differences and talk about some of the options that you might have for pavement design. Drainage analysis, we'll do a rough preliminary look at drainage. Again, we're going to be adding a lot of pavement out there. It's got to be drained to somewhere. I'm not the drainage engineer, so I have no idea where they're going to propose to put it, but we'll look at that from a conceptual perspective and make some recommendations in terms of where drainage can be addressed as you extend that runway. So we'll have to look at that. Environmental impacts, the master plan did a very general environmental baseline for what the environmental resources are in and around the airport. Again, we're going to focus in on what environmental resources are impacted solely for a runway extension, and we'll document what potential impacts may be and if there's any problems that may arise. Preliminary construction phasing, again, when we extend a runway, that's going to take the instrument landing system out of commission for a while. That's going to have impacts on the operations of the airport. We're going to look at how that can be phased, how the construction of a runway extension could be phased. Sometimes on big runway extensions, they'll do the outer portion and kind of work their way back in towards the existing threshold, so the runway displacement is minimized. But again, those are phasing techniques that we'll look at, and we'll make recommendations in terms of how the project should be phased or could be phased to minimize the impacts on the operations of the airport and specifically the instrument landing system. Cost, certainly we'll come up with much more detailed cost estimates than the master plan did to give you folks a better way to make an informed decision about how you want to move forward with the project. A schedule, we'll look at schedule because, as I've mentioned, certainly through the master planning process, it's a long schedule to get through this phase of it, the environmental phase, design, and then certainly construction. So we'll put together a detailed schedule so you folks can see how that's going to kind of unfold over the future, and what things can be done concurrently and what things have to be done sequentially. So we'll put that together to help out everyone's understanding. We will look at the instrument landing system and how that will be impacted and how that's going to need to be relocated, and some of the challenges that may arise from an operational perspective. And then we'll also look at your instrument approach procedure, because you have the ILS approaches that end of the runway that we would be extending. So that instrument approach procedure needs to be modified, because certainly adding runway length to it, that approach procedure is going to be changed. So we'll talk about what that will entail, the time period that will take, and when that could be recommissioned to enhance the approach procedure and the reliability of that runway during weather conditions. Certainly, public involvement is going to be important, as it was with the master plan. It's going to be an important aspect of this project as well, or this study as well. We have a couple of technical review meetings with FAA to make sure that they're on board with how this is progressing and the decisions that you make throughout the study. We've identified 3 public meetings, very similar to what we did with the master plan. We commonly have open house style format with Q&A to address questions from the public. So we've recommended 3 public meetings during the duration of the study. And then just periodic updates to you folks throughout it. I'll come up as often as you like to brief you folks and give you some advice on how it's transforming throughout the process. And then we'll do a draft report, get comments from Robin and her team and you folks, and then we'll publish the final, and then we'll move on from there. The important aspect about this is FAA. When they see a project of like this, a runway extension that has this many moving parts to it, these types of studies are really critical, because they give the FAA the ability to say, yes, that project is warranted, yes, you know exactly what you need, and yes, the time is now to move forward on the environmental piece of it. Because the environmental, you really don't start the environmental until you know you have a project. And a master plan just identifies all of your capital projects over the planning horizon. Well, this study communicates to the FAA that we have a project, we know exactly what the project is, and we're ready for it. And that gives the FAA the ability to say, okay, then let's take that step to get the environmental clearance so we can move forward with the project. Okay, so that's a real, what you're doing is very important. It's very common for detailed studies like this to be performed in advance of an environmental. Okay, it also, quite frankly, makes the environmental just a little bit easier because the question of what is the project and why do you need it and what are the costs associated with it have already been defined. Okay, so it kind of gives you a little bit of a jump start when you do the environmental process. So, and some of the, some of the benefits associated with the project. Is this the right one? Wrong button. Okay. So some of the benefits, certainly as we extend Runway, we're going to push all the aircraft taking off further away from the community on the other end of the airport. So that's a real benefit to the community, that those flights, yet they're still going to be going over where they always go over, but they'll be that much higher and that noise will be dissipated to some extent over those communities. So that will be a benefit to the surrounding communities around the airport, and something that will help, with the noise complaints. Certainly the aerial firefighting operations, we talked about, this improvement to the runway will certainly benefit them. As Robin mentioned, they won't be the sole driver behind it. It won't be extended because of their needs, but they will be a beneficiary of the extended runway based on the airline commercial service needs. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Robin.
Thanks, Charlie. So right now what the air carrier is doing until the runway is lengthening, we are going to continue to have summer schedule changes, so we can anticipate that will continue, as well as the hiatus that we're expecting in the second Denver flight. The first Denver flight shouldn't be affected. That usually goes out at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. It'll be the second Denver flight that starts in March, which is going out about 10:30, I believe. That is going to be affected by this. They will also reduce available seats for purchase on the LA flights. That will continue over the summer months, and they will seek to reduce weight. The other thing we ran into over the summer is there were some delays, and those delays were often associated with the fact that as they were about ready to go, airfield conditions changed. And so as a result, they actually had to empty people off the plane who had already gotten on in a few cases. Not only was that obviously uncomfortable or awkward for those that were affected by that, but also it caused a delay that rippled throughout the system for people who might have missed flights because of those delays. We are going to have a new device installed at the airport. It's an ACARS device, which is actually going to be a transmittal of data system that will be, it's being paid for by the airline. It's approximately a $50,000 system that's being put in that will help expedite information on weight and balance back and forth between the pilots and the dispatch folks. So that can help to reduce some of those delays. But of course, we want to make the experience as pleasurable as possible for all the passengers and not have those weight reductions have to be imposed in the last few minutes. I think it's real important to note that a couple of things will not happen as a result of this. One is we aren't looking for measurably larger airplanes. We have a critical aircraft that's going to be confirmed by Dibble, but it's basically being established by the FAA. The critical aircraft is the Embraer 170 or 175. Our current weight on the runway, maximum gross takeoff weight, is 100,000 pounds. And so as a result, we are not looking for 737s or other large aircraft to come in and serve the airport with this runway extension. So we're looking at more of an extension and not a weight increase, maximum weight increase. The second thing that this runway extension will not affect is the expected increase in general aviation flight training operations. So I want to take a moment to discuss that with everyone.
Hey, Robin, Councilman Lamerson has a...
Okay, go ahead.
Actually, I want to go back to the 100,000 pounds, Robin.
Yeah,
Refresh, council, please.
sure.
Payload for a slurry bomber.
Okay, so it depends on which aircraft they're using. There are multiple aircraft. They have waivers right now for 6 airplanes that do weigh in excess of 100,000 pounds, maximum gross takeoff weight. There is an exception by the FAA that no more than 500 operations a year can be performed above your weight level before it can cause destruction to the runway. So we're real careful about giving those exceptions out for life and limb.
Thank you for that. I think it's important for the public to understand that where we're at, especially consider the wildland fire situation that we're in.
Yes.
You know, I would hate to think that we would compromise or choose to compromise public health and safety for passenger travel over that of fire suppression.
Absolutely not. So the important part of this, obviously, is that we will continue to be able to allow those exceptions in the same manner as we have in the past for the firefighting operations for the aircraft that are larger aircraft. You will not see a DC-10 land here. Those will land somewhere else. But you will see aircraft that can weigh somewhere between 130 and 180,000 pounds maximum gross takeoff weight, being able to operate on a selective basis, less than 500 per year, that will continue to support the firefighting operation. There will be no change in that.
Thank you.
Okay. So what we have here is we have aircraft traffic, and I do want to bring this up. If you haven't heard, we are the 44th busiest airport in the country. And we are ranked immediately below Oakland and above Portland, Dallas Love Field, Memphis, San Diego, Raleigh-Durham, and Houston Hobby. The good news is, even if we were to increase airline operations once a year for the next 5 years, the air carrier traffic is only going to be less than 2% of the total operations. As a flight training airport, at our all-time high, we reached 338,000 operations in 2002. And those could go up again, but that is irrespective of the runway extension. Those operations at 338,000 occurred at the current runway length. So extending the runway will not increase the flight training operations. What is going to increase the flight training operations is the pilot shortage and the addition of aircraft and students operating out of the 5 flight schools that are currently at Prescott. And that, regardless of what happens on the runway extension, will increase and decrease at its own pace. So here's an example of what we refer to as 4 flights per day through 10 flights per day, and I see that as 1 extra flight per year for the next 5 years. And so 10 flights per day would be 5 in and 5 out, so it's total aircraft operations. And again, that's only 1.55% of the total aircraft operations at Prescott. So it will be almost unnoticeable. It's a very small amount. So to summarize, the focused runway planning study will last about 7 to 8 months. The study cost is $198,944. $150,000 of this will come from the Airport Capital Fund, and we actually have achieved some capital cost savings from equipment acquisitions, taxiway Charlie design relocation reductions, the circuit regeneration on runway, the crosswind runway, and the master lock system all came in below our estimates. So we anticipate $48,944 will come from the general fund, and the rest will be from the current Airport Capital Fund. The ultimate runway extension project pathway, I suppose you want to know how long this will take. In year 1, we're in planning. If things work out well in the planning phase, we could move into environmental next year. The following year, if land acquisition is needed, depending on the runway length and available land, we would have to execute that. The following year would be approximately 1 year of design, and it could be 1 to 2 years of construction. Best case scenario, 4.5 years. Worst case, 7.
I was hoping
Depending
for
on-
3, but
And that's it.
all right. Thank you, Charlie and Robin. Questions, comments from the council? All right. Any public comment?
No, Mayor.
All right. Well, you guys did a good job. Thank you. No questions today. Before we adjourn, I apologize for anyone in the audience that thought we were doing water for study session today. I know that there was a letter to the editor speaking to that, which was incorrect. So we will adjourn and be back at 3 o'clock.